Hey everyone, welcome to Group Text. Okay, we're going to indulge me in more true crime because we all know that is one of my favorite things. And I have someone who has written a true crime book and has been part of a true crime story. Let's see. In 1995, Marcia Clark became a household name as the lead prosecutor in the OJ Simpson Trial, a case so widely covered by the media, it was dubbed Trial of the Century. In addition to her esteemed legal career, Marcia is also the author of 9 legal thrillers, as well as a best-selling memoir about her experiences during the Simpson case. Her new book, Trial by Ambush, Murder, Injustice, and the Truth About the Case of Barbara Graham, is out now. And it's Marcia's first foray, which is insane to me, into the world of true crime. The book tells the little-known story of what was then called the Trial of the Century, which resulted in the conviction and execution of Barbara Graham, who was found guilty of the murder of an elderly woman in 1953. Okay, let's just get right into it. Marcia Clark, welcome to Group Text.
Hi.
Okay, I can't even get my head around that this is your first true crime book, but we'll come back to that. I want to dive right into the book, which, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
When did you first hear about Barbara Graham and her case?
So I had never heard of her. It was one of those weird things where I had decided after many years, and I agree with you. I don't know why it took me so long to get into writing about true crime. I know.
I mean, I can understand with your life being a little saturated by it.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. I really do. I don't know if you know this, but I'm an appellate lawyer now, and I handle criminal appeals, court-appointed appeals for the indigent on appeal. So when you're convicted of a felony, by the time you have been through a trial, you're tapped out. You can't afford a lawyer, and everybody knows that. So the Court of Appeal appoints lawyers to represent you in your direct appeal, to which you are entitled in California. I think probably throughout the country, that's the case. So I handle true crime every day. And so when anybody would say, hey, why don't you write a true crime book? I do it all the time. I know it's briefing. It's not the same. But then I really realized, finally, I came to the realization that, that might be a really cool thing to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Melissa, it took me way too long to get here, but I got here. And I was looking at a completely different case. I wasn't looking at Barbara Graham. Never heard of her. Saw her name, she was like a footnote at the bottom of a page. Why you should check that out. So I did. And then I saw she was the basis for a film that was there, and it was their trial of the century. And it was an Oscar-winning film called I Want to Live. And her role was played by Susan Hayward. And I thought, oh, forget it. Everybody's going to have written about this. I'm not going to bother. Why do it again?
And the Hayward family, in a weird sort of twist, was involved in a lot of crazy, I don't think there was any true crime in there, but a lot of crazy big Hollywood, not crime of the century, but sensationalistic stories having nothing to do with the movie that Susan Hayward was in. Just want to say that. That's like one of those weird things.
So cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I did not know that. Thank you for telling me. That's so interesting.
Go read Haywire, Brooke Hayward's book, her daughter.
Oh, I will. Oh, thank you. I will.
There you go. There you go. So, okay. So
downloading now.
Exactly. The movie, I Want to Live.
I Want to Live. So she won an Oscar for that. And I thought I was never going to write about this because everybody would have written about it. Why go there? But I thought, what? I'm kind of curious. Let me see. And sure enough, no one had written about it except for one reporter who had done tabloid coverage of the case. And I read his book, and it was very small, one of those thin paperback things. And it was wildly inaccurate, even from what little I knew of the case. And there was stuff in there that I knew couldn't be right. So I thought, well, nobody's really told the story of this trial. And that's what got me thinking, I am curious. So I look into Barbara Graham a little bit more, and I realize she's beautiful. She is the product of neglect and abandonment her whole life. Her mother threw her out basically when she was born, and she kept coming back. Her mother threw her into a reform school that she knew was basically a torture chamber because she herself had been in that reform school. Mm-hmm. Barbara would escape and run home, and her mother would call the cops, have her arrested, and thrown back in again. It was like something out of a hideous torture movie. You can't, Mommy Dearest got nothing on Barbara's mother.
And
So
the fact that Barbara's mother also kept the other kids.
yes,
That she, I mean,
yes,
her entire life is tragic.
yeah, exactly.
Tragic.
Really tragic. Yet she, with no schooling or very little, I don't even think she made it through eighth grade. She was very smart. She loved classical music. She loved jazz. She read Omar Khayyam. She read Oscar Wilde. It was crazy. And she had a criminal past. I mean, she was not an angel, but she was the kind of criminal that you see fringe people with no skills commit. It was check kiting. It was shoplifting, prostitution. She got married a bunch of times because she was beautiful. And that's how she made her way. And so eventually she became a dice girl, which is a shill for
And
these little. Yeah.
explain what that is. Because a
So what?
shill is fascinating, and it has a different name now. I don't remember, but this is actually a occupation.
Yeah. Sure it was. I mean, now you really don't need to have a shill to get people to gamble. They go to Las Vegas, they drop a fortune, they're just there. But back in the day, they had all these little illegal gambling houses. And I'm talking little, like a little ranch house where they maybe have a basement. California doesn't have very many of those basements, but they have little rooms and they would get shut down if the cops ever found them, but they operated quite a bit. And they would get girls to go to these hotel bars and pick up men, and the men would want to go somewhere else. And the girl would say, well, why don't we stop at this place I know? And they'd serve booze, and she would get the men to gamble. That was her job. So she did that for this man named Emmett Perkins. What she didn't know, Emmett Perkins was her friend, quote unquote. What she didn't know is that Emmett Perkins was a big time criminal who had committed murders. And his friend, Jack Santos, was an even bigger. He was a mass murderer. She didn't know this. So at that time, they decided she was on the outs with her husband. They had a little child. She was trying to make ends meet. Her husband, whom she had been madly in love with, turned out to be a junkie. He didn't want to work. He was on unemployment and they had no money. Her shoplifting was not putting enough food on the table. And even the dice girl was starting to kind of dry up. She was in bad straits. The two men, Jack Santos and Emmett Perkins, heard rumors about this older woman who lived in this quiet little house in Burbank, nice little suburban neighborhood, 2 miles from where I used to live,
Which is crazy.
It's crazy. I mean, there's all these little things that were like little tiny connections that I had to the case that were just wild. So there was a rumor in the criminal community in Los Angeles that Mabel Monahan, who lived in this little house in Burbank, had a ton of money in her house because her daughter had been married to this casino entrepreneur named Tudor Scherer, who had moved to Las Vegas. When they got divorced, he left her the house. She didn't want the house. She gave it to her mother, Mabel Monahan. Mabel had been a vaudeville trooper. She was a roller skater, and she had been married to a world famous roller and ice skater. They became a dynamic duo touring the vaudeville circuit. And then she settled down in this house that her daughter gave her. She remained friendly with her daughter's ex-husband, Tudor Scherer, and he would come to visit her. And that's what got the rumors started. All of the criminals who knew Tudor Scherer, because he had been selling booze during Prohibition, he had tried to start a gambling operation in Los Angeles, but that was dangerous because Mickey Cohen, the major league gangster at that time, was in control of all the gambling. So he didn't want to die. And that's what made him take off for Las Vegas. But he would come to visit often. And when he did, he would stop and see Mabel. That made all the criminals say, oh, it must be for nefarious purposes. He must be stashing money in her house. He wasn't, but they believed it. It was, as Barbara would later say, their fairy tale. Mabel Monahan was very security conscious. How are they going to get into the house? She would never open the door to one of these men, but she would to a beautiful, small, petite woman like Barbara. So Barbara was decoy.
Exactly. So how did this group of men convince Barbara to do this? I mean, she was a small-time criminal. She's made some stupid errors in judgment about people. She gave a friend of a friend an alibi that was completely wrong, and that came back to bite her. Like, oh, your friend Bob needs an alibi? I've never met him, but yeah, sure, no big deal. Yeah, Bob was with me. And I mean, he continues to make these not good decisions. Why did she decide to do this? Because it was unsavory characters, the 4 or 5 men that we get into that are all part of this.
Yeah, I mean, it was judgment was not a strong suit for her. But then again, these unsavory characters were the only family she knew. These were the people who would take her in, who would take care of her, and they were her friends. Some of them were decent to her. And Emmett Perkins was actually decent to her. Jack Santos was a different matter, but he didn't know her that well. He came on the scene kind of late. She didn't know him. He was Emmett Perkins' friend. She was in bad straits because her husband, the junkie, was not making any money, and she needed to support him and her baby with him, Tommy. So it was, I'm sure they promised her a little share of the take if she would just be their decoy. So she said, okay. And she went and sure enough, knocked on the door for Mabel Monahan and said, oh, my car broke down. If you could just let me use your phone. And Mabel, who would never have let anybody else in the house, let her in. And the men came in behind her. And her body was found the next day, bludgeoned, beaten, bloodied, strangled to death. She had been dragged down the hallway. There were blood on the walls, furniture turned over, carpets pulled up. They had gone through that house like a tornado. They even went through Mabel's closet, went and dumped out all of her purses, all except for one. One was left hanging on a hook. And it turned out that it was full of cash, like hundreds of dollars worth of cash and all kinds of expensive jewelry.
Because Mabel had a poker game, wasn't it? So
Yes.
Mabel had her weekly poker winnings with her. And they met.
Yes.
There was the one thing they didn't look at. But again, they thought there was going to be a windfall. And they would have gotten a couple $100 and some jewelry.
Right. That's right. It was nothing like what they expected to get. And Mabel was such a trippy, cool lady. You know, she had this regular poker game that she would go to, and she did the night before she died. They played till all hours of the night. She would then she would carry her jewelry around with her and show it to all her friends, you know. But yeah, you're right. She had her winnings in her purse. And then they went out to lunch at 3:00 in the morning at a steakhouse. And her friend came back with her, spent the night, and then they had coffee the next day. Her friend left. She was sitting and reading a murder mystery, The Purple Pony, when Barbara knocked on the door. What a shame.
What a shame. So this is all the prelude to what the book really focuses on, which is what happened in that house, who did what, and how, I don't want to say Barbara was scapegoated, about how it all became about her rather than the trial.
Yeah. And you know what? You can go ahead and say she was scapegoated because she was. So they didn't have any leads. They had no witnesses. They had no physical evidence. They had no way to break this case. They had to find someone on the inside who was involved in order to solve this case. They put out their feelers to all the informants they had in the area, and eventually they hit pay dirt. And they found one guy who happened to have been their lookout at the house. He wasn't involved. He didn't go inside, but he knew he was involved in the planning stages. He was the one who actually knew where Mabel lived. So he led them to her house. He sat outside. He gave them a full statement about all the players who were involved. He didn't know Barbara's name. He called her Mary, but he knew that a woman was involved. And they eventually figured out that Emmett Perkins had a girlfriend. The girlfriend's name was Barbara Graham. So one thing led to another, and they eventually figured out who everyone was, but no one was talking. So they still couldn't crack the case. They went to one person who was a friend of Jack Santos, who worked up north. His name was John True. He was an accomplice.
Which is, by the way, very ironic.
As I call him, the ironically named John True, because he was one of the biggest liars in the whole thing. But they went up north, they found him, and they turned him. He got turned state's evidence. It took them like 3 days to break him down and get him to agree, and he insisted on complete immunity, which they gave him. So he got a complete walk. He told the story that Barbara was the one who pistol whipped Mabel Monahan, and it was a complete lie. But there was no way to disprove it because those two were alone in the house with Mabel. No one else could see what happened. I found a way, actually, in piecing together all the evidence, to figure out that it could not have been her that pistol whipped Mabel Monahan. But that was based on a lot of stuff the jury never got to see, in part because the prosecution never revealed it to the defense. John True gave a statement up north back when he was given immunity, that statement got buried by the prosecution. They never turned it over. And it was inconsistent with the story that he told when he testified before the jury. So that was one piece of evidence, but there was much more that the jury never got to see. And so that became the whole thing of the discovery of this case. It took a long time to amass all of the information because it was such an old case.
Well,
And
you
just
talk
even-
about that in the book. Was you realized that you were interested in this, and the whole forward of the book is about this, which I found fascinating. Was like, okay, this is interesting, and then because we forget there were no computers, there were no digital records, there was not really real DNA. It was all these different things that you had to track down, not just the transcripts of the case, but specific notes. And,
Right.
I didn't realize that what you would read from the court clerk wasn't the same as you would read, was it the stenographer's notes? Because it's, one's all business, one's all context. And you went on a really deep dive. And once you started vamping through all this, when you start to figure out all these different pieces that didn't add up, were you more shocked about the prosecutorial misconduct, that they got away with it, or just how bad the defense was?
No, the defense actually was great. That's what was so. I started out thinking, first of all, the lead prosecutor in this case, J. Miller Levy, was an icon in the LADA's office, right? He was somebody that we would even joke about whenever somebody would lose a case or lose a motion, we would say, J. Miller Levy would have won it,
Yeah.
It was a joke, but it wasn't a joke. He was that kind of revered person in the office. So I really expected to be wowed. I expected to see my hero in action, and I expected to actually see that the defense was going to be kind of asleep at the wheel. And I expected that because some of the early investigation I was able to do through old archived newspapers and clippings showed that the defense at one point had asked to be relieved as counsel for Barbara. And I thought, boy, that's a sleazy move. Why would you do that? I found out why, and it was anything but sleazy. Actually, the defense worked tirelessly. I have never seen anything like it. I mean, they really spared no effort to protect her, to go after the prosecution's case, to defend her. And you have to remember back then when the court appointed counsel to represent someone who had no money, they didn't get paid at all. The state didn't pay them. So they were doing it for free. And you imagine, how do they pay the rent when they aren't
Right.
making any money on a case that takes months to try? Nevertheless, they spared no expense and they spared no effort in tirelessly defending Barbara. So they really did an amazing job. On the other hand, the prosecution was about as sleazy and low-handed, underhanded as they could possibly get. Every trick in the book that they could think of demonized her on a personal level that I found so offensive in reading about it that there were times that I'm reading the transcripts of what happened in that trial. I had to get up and walk away because I got too mad to write. It was too upsetting. No prosecutor should be doing what they did, because the prosecutor's job is not like a defense attorney. A defense attorney owes his client complete loyalty, and that's the only person he's there to take care of. A prosecutor's job is to ensure that the defendant gets a fair trial and that he's fairly convicted, and that he presents proof beyond a reasonable doubt to justify a conviction, and acquires that evidence by fair means and shares the evidence properly, discovering it for the defense. They did none of the above.
And she
awful.
got painted as the femme fatale. And
Yeah.
first of all, it didn't help that she was beautiful. But what is interesting, and one of the things you do get into, is the media latched on to her.
Yeah.
And this whole narrative about who she was, why she was the way she was, what she did, became completely out of control. And so much of it wasn't factual.
Right.
And I mean, starting with everything was about her appearance, how she turned around and looked over her shoulder. There was one story you tell where she legitimately fell down the stairs and actually got hurt on her way to court. And it became this big drama that she threw herself down the stairs and all these, like, it literally, it felt like nobody cared even one scintilla what was really happening. And one of the parallels you sort of draw is this was 1953. This wasn't the 24-hour news cycle. This wasn't TMZ. This wasn't court TV. This was almost complete. This woman was basically completely generated by the media.
Yeah, exactly right. It was amazing to me to what degree they focused on the hair, the makeup, the clothing, every move she made, every breath she took. And it wasn't just that. It was the way they sensationalized everything to a point where you couldn't see the truth at all. She was demonized, constantly demonized from day one as the evil-hearted, cold-blooded murderess, and they called her Bloody Babs and spared no adjective for ways to vilify her constantly. And I remember reading at one point that when her ex-husband came in, and by that time he had divorced her, but he came in to testify, and they described her as having glared at him malevolently, her eyes pools of gleaming, hatred. And I look at the picture that they took of her at that time, and she had just turned to look over her shoulder. There was no malevolence in her face whatsoever. Nothing. She turned to see him walking in the courtroom. That's it. And they turned this into a whole Donnybrook. And like you said, she fell down the stairs at the very beginning of trial. She got very badly hurt. They put her in the hospital. She couldn't speak for hours. I mean, it was a serious injury. And they were rumoring behind the scenes, and they said unnamed officials, whom I have to say was probably the prosecutors, theorizing that she was doing it to buy time. Are you kidding? Would you really? I mean, she could have killed herself. So there was nothing that she could do that wasn't fodder for them to vilify her yet again. And it never stopped. And the other two guys that are sitting next to her, these awful looking thugs, Santos and Perkins, looked exactly like what they were murderers. They got almost no mention. I mean, the publisher at one point asked me can you like dig up some newspaper descriptions of these guys? It took days to find even a line describing them, even 2 lines. What you see in the book is everything they wrote about them, which is this much, because they were so busy focused on Barbara.
Yeah, I think one of them you write was called hulking, like any sort of bizarre words. Before we move on from the trial, nowadays, and even back then, the defensive lawyers would tell these women, do not look stylish or vampy. Yet they allowed her to come into court with tight skirts and full glam, full hair and makeup, the whole thing. It's almost like she painted herself into a corner where you go back and you look at, I mean, just off the top of my head, Amber Heard, who suddenly was in high neck blouses, during the Johnny Depp trial. Why didn't they stop her? I mean, everything she did was a bad idea, and then played into the narrative of this Black Widow's wrong, but this femme fatale.
Yeah. Well, and I do talk about that in the book. Like, why didn't she win? And you remember Casey Anthony as well.
Yeah.
Ms. Wet T-shirt contest suddenly was a librarian.
No
like
makeup, hair, and a bun. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right. I don't know that they didn't tell her to tone it down. They may have. I suspect, knowing what I saw of the defense attorneys in the transcripts and all the work that they did, they probably did tell her to tone it down. But she had to feel like herself. She had to feel pulled together. And the tight skirts, these skirt suits were the style back then. I mean, that was the way women dressed. And, the makeup and all that, that was her. So I think it was more like, if I had to guess, I would say it was her armor,
Yeah.
and it made her feel like she was protected because she was looking as good as she could look. Did that harm her with the jurors? Probably so. The men, J. Miller Levy, in closing argument, said, you know why she took the witness stand? because she wanted to turn your heads, men. Men, she's trying to seduce you. She had no reason to want to testify other than to seduce you. So you don't be taken in by that. Are you kidding me? The woman is on trial for her life. She took the stand because she had no choice. And if you read the book, you'll know why.
Yes.
So, I mean, it was horrible. And yet one of those male jurors afterwards was quoted as saying, yeah, I didn't fall for her game, not for 1 second. You think Levy's argument didn't have something to do with it? Of course it did. And then, women can be each other's worst enemy. And so the papers, one of the newspapers wrote about juror number 5, who was this very buttoned up, very plain looking woman who looked down her nose at Barbara and didn't approve of the way she had makeup on and all the rest of it. I mean, Barbara couldn't win for losing, honestly.
So she, without giving everything away, even though we know how it ends, she's convicted. It's very rare, even now, for women to be sentenced with the death penalty. There still is the whole idea, which I really think isn't just an idea. It is true that women do not commit violent crimes at that level in general.
Right.
Yet she managed to actually hit the end of the road in death row.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do believe that had this been a fair trial, she may still have been convicted because she was involved in the home invasion, robbery, and burglary. But I do not think she would have been put to death had she had a fair trial. And I think that the excesses that the prosecution engaged in had everything to do with the fact that they condemned her to death.
So, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that you being in such a public trial with OJ had a lot of parallels to what was going on. At one point you said that you barely recognized the person being described in the press during the OJ Simpson trial as you. Did you think that really affected how you approached, and that's a very specific point of view, approached Barbara?
Not much beyond what you just said, in the sense I didn't expect to see any parallels, honestly. It was so long ago, and there was no cameras really in the courtroom other than every once in a while a still photo. I mean, it's not the same thing as watching people moving around in the courtroom in real time.
Right.
So I didn't expect to find that, but what I did find, and it was surprising to me, and I'm still thinking about what this all means. At that time, there were multiple newspapers all vying for attention and all competing with one another. And because that's where people got their news, even though there was television and there was radio, but it was limited.
There wasn't social media? That's not how people got their news then?
Isn't that remarkable? It's crazy.
Crazy. Read the newspaper? Nuts.
It's nuts. Who reads a newspaper? Honest to God. But that's all they did was read newspapers, and there were quite a few of them. And they were all vying with each other to be the most sensational, their version of clickbait. And so one would try to top the next, and it just got more and more crazy and out of control to the point where the truth had been buried completely under layers of nonsense that was nothing more than sensational garbage. So there was a huge distortion in what people were reading. Very little of it made it, what was actually what was going on. In the Simpson case, the same thing did happen. Kind of writ larger in the sense because you had moving pictures that kind of underlined what was written, but the writing was the same problem. It was distorted, it was sensationalized, and worst of all, it was not vetted. You would see reporters walk into the men's room with someone from the defense team and walk out with a scoop, quote unquote. I mean, do you really think that what you're getting now is anything but spin by the defense? Fine by me. I mean, they're entitled to do it, but you as the reporter should be looking into what's true. In any case, the papers back then all fell in lockstep, and they all went after Barbara, and they all demonized her, and they all sensationalized in the same way, in that they painted Barbara as this evil villain, and they painted John True, the accomplice, who was gum deep in this murder case, as the savior of Mabel Monahan, as the one who was the knight in shining armor, as the hero, which is how he tried to paint himself.
Right.
I can't believe they were so credulous.
Yeah, he claimed he loosened the sheet that they had been tied around her neck and cut a hole so she could breathe. I mean, the joke is it's so well written that you fall into going, well, that was the right thing to do. When you're like, wait a minute, in context, nobody just took the pillowcase off this poor dying woman's head. How
Right.
lovely that you cut a hole.
Yeah.
I mean, these were really lowest common denominator of people.
They really were. And so the other thing is John True's discussion, his testimony regarding how Mabel was being pistol whipped by Barbara and how Barbara held on to her, and all the physical, logistical descriptions he gave were impossible. It made no sense. I actually tried to reenact it, and I talked about that in the book with a friend of mine. There's no way Barbara could have accomplished that. No way. So the fact that no one in the press thought to question any of this blew my mind. Really? You're just buying this bullshit story, hook, line, and sinker? Nobody's stopping to think that this made no sense. Barbara's so small. She's 5'3", 120 pounds. There's no way she can control this woman who outweighed her by at least 40 pounds. I mean, give me. So anyway, that's what's different today, though. And that's what makes me think about the virtue and the value of podcasts like yours, and all the different sources we have where people are willing to be a dissident voice, to say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Wait a minute, I don't buy that. And you've seen it happen already with certain cases that have been in the news. Michael Brown, Jason Blake, where things did not happen exactly as it was initially reported. And people came back afterwards to say, now it's unfortunate it didn't happen in the moment, but I think we're all up on our toes a little more and more willing to look more carefully in the moment at what's being reported, as whether it's, do we have the whole picture? Is it in context? These things really matter.
So again, it was called the trial of the century in the time. There's always a lot of trials of the century. It seems like who decides if it lives up to that moniker? Because just in this century, I can name like 5 off the top of my head. You know what I mean? Who decides, what commission decides, oh, this is the trial of the century? Why is it that we keep reusing that term?
Oh, I think it's clickbait. You know what I mean? If this is an effort to get eyes on and get ears on and get people excited about it, because you have to make it a big deal, and then people are going to pay attention. If you say, well, here's another murder case, they go, okay, here's another murder. You know what I mean? So yeah, we wind up with an awful lot of trials of the century. It's true.
But what I found interesting, a lot of these other quote unquote trial of the centuries, we know about them. This one, people didn't know about. Why?
Yeah, that's true.
I mean,
I don't know.
We can go back. We know trials of the century from starting in the 20s. We can recall specific ones. Yet this one was completely forgotten to history in a way.
It really was. Yeah. Melissa, it's funny, isn't it? I had never heard of her. And when I stumbled on it and found out that it was the subject of this Oscar-winning film, I was like, and yet we know nothing about it. And the articles written over time, over the past, say, 20, 30 years, and an article here, an episode there, not much. Very superficial, very little. Nobody bothered to get the trial transcripts and see what really happened in court, which to me was the most twists and turns I've ever seen in a trial in my life. I mean, Simpson doesn't compare to what happened in that case. It was crazy. So, why? Good question. I don't know.
Yeah, the question, why? Are there any other true crime cases that you've started to look at and go, this might be interesting? Is this a one and done? Or are we going to see more true crime from you?
My plan is to do more. I really love doing this because it does give you the opportunity to talk about more than just the crime. You can talk about, how court cases are being tried, the ethics of our justice system at work, the way a case is investigated, then all the issues that case kicks up in terms of, in this case, I mean, misogyny was definitely a theme here, but also prosecutorial ethics was a theme here. These are things that we should always, these are evergreen themes that we really can talk about, today, and is still very relevant. So I think that I would really like to find another case to dig into, because this was fascinating. It was really, really fascinating to work on.
We've had so many cases lately in the news. I mean, everything from, Diddy, and now Jay-Z's gotten pulled into it. Susan Smith is back again. the Menendez brothers, one after another. Which one interests you the most? Which one do you, when you're looking through everything in the morning, which article do you read first?
I have not read anything about Diddy's case, other than I saw that Jay-Z got pulled into it, and I read his lawyer's letter.
Yeah.
His letter in response, which was good, well written. He's a good lawyer.
Yeah.
At least I assume it was his lawyer, because I think that's what they usually do.
Well, they
give
them what they want, and then you rewrite it so it's in your voice, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's very well written, and if Jay-Z wrote it, good for him, good on him. It felt like a lawyer's letter, but it was good. Am I following the Menendez a little bit? But honestly, I feel like the case has been gone over so much. It's not one that I would want to write about, because it has been done and done and done. Documentaries.
Which one are you personally following out of interest, just to yourself, not to write a book?
Oh, I don't think I'm really following any of them very carefully, to be honest with you. I handle so many of my own true crime cases, and that's a lot of work, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah.
So I usually don't have time to read them. And I am actually actively looking for the next case to really dig into. So I don't really have time to follow. Which one do you follow the most?
Oh, let's see. I tend to go in phases. I was deep in, who couldn't be saturated by the Menendez thing. I think what's coming up now, which will be very interesting to me, is the change in the DA's office.
Yeah.
Here in LA. That's going to be the next big thing. I didn't know a lot about the Garth Brooks one until earlier today, because I've had a fabulous crime day on the podcast. Trying to understand that Garth Brooks filed in federal court and the accuser filed in state court. So I found that kind of interesting. I don't know. I think from my perspective, I tend to get drawn at the ones where you just go, how fucking stupid could you possibly be? Like, people who are so smart that they pull off some of this shit, and then they do stuff that is so incredibly stupid that I become fascinated. It's like what I used to say to my son when he was a teenager. How did you think this was going to end? I'm just curious. How did you think this was going to end? But right now I'm interested in the Diddy one, because I love watching everyone scrambling for shelter. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also I think the public doesn't understand that there were two different parties. There was this big famous white party in the Hamptons. They're like, this Bieber was there in this. It's like, this was a different party, So I think that's going to be the best, watching from the sideline, is watching people scramble.
When it goes to trial, I think that'll be, then we'll get, because I don't really know specifics of what he's been accused of. I only know generally it's
real bad. It's real bad. Real bad.
Yeah. Drugging and raping and that sort of thing is what
but isn't that just old hat by now?
It happened.
Another one. But what's been fascinating is, he's been complaining about the, how life is like in prison, and the food's really bad. And, that's why he wants to be let out on bail, is he's not used to living like this. And you're like, all right, buddy. You mentioned something at the very beginning that I wanted to circle back to. You are now a court of appeal lawyer, and you get assigned to people. When you walk in and say, hi, I'm your attorney, do they become shocked when you're like, hi, I'm Marcia Clark, I'm your attorney? Like, what reaction do you get?
So I don't walk into anywhere. This is when you handle court-appointed cases on appeal, a direct appeal, it's all in writing. Everything is done in writing. So they send me the record. I write to the client. We exchange letters. So that's how I communicate with them. They don't see me. They eventually, I don't tell them. I mean, they see my name on the letterhead. I have to tell them, who I am. Some of them figure it out, some of them do not. Generally speaking, so far they've all, knock wood, they've all been happy to have me. So I haven't had any trouble. It's been a good thing.
But I just think that,
you
in my silly mind, you're sitting there, who's going to be my attorney? Watching like, holy shit. And it's that, I know you. Did we go to high school together? It's that kind of a thing.
You look so familiar.
Exactly. Marcia Clark, this has been a complete and total absolute joy. Read the book. It's wonderful. I'm making sure I have the name of it correct, so I can't just say Marcia Clark's new book. You must read the book, Trial by Ambush. It's on sale now. Thank you so much. This was so fun.
Thank you, Melissa. It was a blast and a half. Thank you very much.